Hey everybody, this is a piece by Dariusz Stola titled Anti-Zionism as a Multipurpose Policy Instrument, the Anti-Zionist Campaign in Poland, 1967 to 1968. Dariusz Stola is a professor of history at the Institute of Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. Stola teaches modern history and studies 20th century human migrations, the Holocaust, Polish-Jewish relations, and the history of post-war Poland's communist regime. From 2014 to 2019, he was director of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. He is the author or co-editor of 7 books and over 100 scholarly papers. Stola is a 2-time recipient of the Polityka Magazine Award and recipient of the award of Edward Radziński Polish Foundation in London, England. Second. According to Wikipedia, under the article, the 1968 Polish political crisis is a series of major student, intellectual, and other protests against the ruling Polish United Workers' Party. Of the Polish People's Republic took place in Poland in March 1968. The crisis led to the suppression of student strikes by security forces in all major academic centers across the country and the subsequent repression of the Polish dissident movement. It was also accompanied by mass emigration following an anti-Semitic, branded, quote, anti-Zionist campaign, waged by the Minister of Internal Affairs, General Mieczysław Mosar, with the approval of the First Secretary Władysław Gomulka of the Polish United Workers' Party. The protests overlapped with the events of the Prague Spring in neighboring Czechoslovakia, raising new hopes of democratic reforms among the intelligentsia. The Czechoslovak unrest culminated in the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia on the 20th of August 1968. The anti-Zionist campaign began in 1967 and was carried out in conjunction with the USSR's withdrawal of all diplomatic relations with Israel after the Six-Day War, but also involved a power struggle within the PZPR itself, the subsequent purges within the ruling party, led by Mosar and his faction, failed to topple Gomulka's government, but resulted in exile from Poland to thousands of communist individuals of Jewish ancestry, including professionals, party officials, and secret police functionaries appointed by Joseph Stalin following the Second World War. In carefully staged public displays of support, factory workers across Poland were assembled to publicly denounce Zionism. At least 13,000 Poles of Jewish origin emigrated in 1968 to 1972. As a result of being fired from their positions and various other forms of harassment. All right, so that's enough background for the text. Introduction: Anti-Zionism in Communist Poland before 1967. The noisy hate campaign that erupted in Poland in March 1968, known as the, quote, anti-Zionist campaign, end quote, became the symbol of communist Poland's attitude towards the Jews in Israel. A second, let me get to the notes here. They got endnotes because they dislike me. Footnote: for an extensive presentation and analysis of the, quote, anti-Zionist campaign of 1967 to 68, see Stola Kampania Anti-Zionist. I don't even know, it's fucking Polish, I can't pronounce that. The archival research for this study was made possible by a grant of the American Jewish Committee. On mass mobilization in the campaign, see Stola's article, Fighting Against the Shadows. And footnote. However, before the campaign, the Polish communist regime had not displayed greater anti-Jewish or anti-Israel tendencies than the other Soviet satellites. It appeared even friendlier or less hostile than most of the regimes in the Soviet bloc, the Soviet one in particular. Footnote: on policies towards Jews in the Soviet bloc, see Gittleman's article, The Evolution. The book. Actually, the article, The Evolution, the book by Lowe, Soviet Jewry, and Pincus the Jews. All right, I'm not going to keep reading these footnotes. They're not conducive to reading. In the early post-war years, the new Polish government tolerated semi-legal Jewish immigration channels and acted favorably in the international arena. It even provided military training for Zionist organizations. In 1949 to 50, the Polish Politburo agreed to a request to allow an emigration scheme, which brought almost 30,000 people to the new state of Israel. Footnote: on Zionist activity in early communist Poland. I can't keep reading this. Why am I doing this? The scheme was a favor, especially in the eyes of many non-Jews who wanted to leave but couldn't. But it also accorded well with the general drive of accelerated Sovietization that began at that time. This included centralizing and taking control of or liquidating Jewish institutions, restricting contacts with Jewish organizations in the West, and diplomatic relations with Israel, and eventually continuing emigration under a broader non-exit policy. To many Polish Jews in the 1940s, the new regime was primarily a radical departure from the Polish regime of the 1930s, which had increasingly drifted towards the anti-Jewish positions of its opponents on the nationalist right. The communists seemed to guarantee safety against Polish anti-Semitism. As Lukian Blitt, a Jewish socialist, wrote, quote, one thing that every group of Jews who had decided to rebuild their lives in Poland, bracket, after World War II, in bracket, was certain about was the conviction that as long as a communist regime was in power, official anti-Semitism would be out of the question, end quote. Lucian Blitt. While many of the regime's officials especially at the lower level shared some popular anti-Jewish prejudice, in the turbulent post-war years the regime made efforts to combat right-wing anti-Semitism and to protect the Jews against attacks. Anti-Jewish resentment did not disappear from Polish society after the overwhelming majority of Polish Jewry perished in the Holocaust. Returning Jews often encountered hostility, whose bloody culmination was the Kielce pogrom in 1946. According to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum refers to a violent massacre of Jews in the southeastern Polish town of Kielce on the 4th of July, 1946. A pogrom took place in Kielce, Poland in July 1946. 42 Jews were massacred and about 50 more were wounded. The event touched off a mass migration of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Poland and other countries of Eastern and Central Europe. This clip shows Russian Jewish refugees, survivors of the pogrom, waiting to leave Poland and crossing into Czechoslovakia. Pogrom is a Russian word meaning, quote, to wreak havoc, to demolish violently, end quote. Historically, the term refers to violent attacks by local non-Jewish populations on Jews in the Russian Empire. During the Kielce incident, a mob of Polish soldiers, police officers, and civilians murdered at least 42 Jews and injured over 40 in the worst outburst of anti-Jewish violence in post-war Poland. The mass violence of the Kielce pogrom drew on an entrenched local history of anti-Semitism, including false allegations accusing Jews of using the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes, a charge known as a, quote, blood libel, with the intent of discouraging the return of Jewish Holocaust survivors to Poland. While the pogrom was not an isolated instance of anti-Jewish violence in post-war Poland, the Kielce massacre convinced many Polish Jews that they had no future in Poland after the Holocaust and spurred them to flee the country. Coming just 1 year after the end of World War II, the massacre shocked people around the world. In 1939, there was approximately 24,000 Jewish inhabitants in Kielce, or 1/3 of the town's population. Almost all of them were murdered during the Holocaust. By the summer of 1946, about 200 Holocaust survivors have returned or settled in Kielce. A minority were able to reclaim some property which had been confiscated by non-Jews during the German occupation. Back to the text. The dark mystery of the hostility towards the Holocaust survivors requires further study and explanation, yet one of its factors is evident. This is the revival of the widespread stereotype of Żydo-Komuna, or Jewish communism, the conviction that communists were mostly Jews and vice versa. I think this is still really prevalent in Poland today. I had no idea there was a Wikipedia article for this. But the notion of Judeo-Bolshevism, for instance, is still prevalent today. I think it's still pretty prevalent today in like the right wing of Polish politics, which I believe to be is quite dominant in Poland these days. Żydo-Komuna, Polish for Judeo-Communism, is an anti-communist and anti-Semitic canard or pejorative stereotype suggesting that most Jews collaborated with the Soviet Union in importing communism to Poland, or that there was an exclusively Jewish conspiracy to do so. A Polish language term for, quote, Jewish Bolshevism, or more literally, quote, Jewish communism, Żydo-Komuna is related to the, quote, Jewish world conspiracy, unquote, myth. The idea originated as anti-communist propaganda at the time of the Polish-Soviet War of 1919-1920 and continued through the interwar period. It is based on long-standing anti-Semitic attitudes, coupled with a historical fear of Russia. Most of Poland's Jews supported the government controlled by Józef Pilsudski. After his death in 1935, rising levels of popular and state anti-Semitism pushed a small minority, several thousands at most, into participating in or supporting communist politics, which were relatively more welcoming to Jews. This was seized upon and inflated by anti-Semites. With the Soviet invasion of Poland and Stalin's 1939 occupation in eastern Poland, the Soviets used privileges and punishments to encourage ethnic and religious differences between Jews and Poles, characterized by Jan Gross as, quote, the institutionalization of resentment, end quote. The stereotype was also reinforced because, as noted by Yoff Schatz, quote, people of Jewish origin constitute a substantial part of the Polish communist movement, end quote, even though, quote, communist ideals and the movement itself enjoyed only very limited support, end quote, among Polish Jews. There was an upsurge in the anti-Semitic stereotype of Jews as communist traitors. It erupted into mass murder when Nazi Germany invaded Soviet Eastern Poland in the summer of 1941. The stereotype endured into post-war Poland because Polish anti-communists saw Poland's Soviet-controlled communist government as the fruition of pre-war communist anti-Polish agitation and associated with the Soviets' appointment of Jews to positions of responsibility in the Polish government. It is also reinforced by the prominent role of a small number of Jews in Poland's Stalinist regime, in particular Jakob Berman and Hilary Mink. Samuel C. Steinlauf noted that Jewish communists, despite their small numbers, have gained a notorious reputation in Poland, quote, believed to have masterminded the enslavement bracket of that country, end bracket, end quote, and became, quote, demonized as part of the Zito Komuna canard. Back to the text. This was the revival of the widespread stereotype of Zito Komuna, or Jewish communism, the conviction that communists were mostly Jews and vice versa, the conspicuous presence of Jews in the apparatus of the regime being brutally imposed on Poland, which is further exaggerated in popular perceptions, seemed to confirm the stereotype of Zito Komuna. The anti-Semitism of the time was largely tied to and symbiotic with anti-communism and anti-Sovietism. The new government fought against it quite sincerely. New section. Sorry, I don't know why I said new section. Back to the text. Or I'm not even back to the text. Sorry, I just spaced out for a second. Obviously, Poland under the communist regime was not a paradise for the Jews. They were deprived of many basic rights and freedoms and exposed to terror, but as a rule, not more so than others. This equality, although peculiar, was not unimportant, as Jews in pre-war Poland, not to speak of the German occupation period, had felt acutely various forms of administrative and societal discrimination. A form of special discrimination against the Jews that marked the communist period was, quote, thinning out comrades of Jewish origin, end quote. That is, a kind of numerus clausus to avoid their, quote, excessive concentration in certain institutions such as the Foreign Service. Wikipedia says numerus clausus, closed number in Latin, is one of the methods used to limit the number of students who may study at a university. In many cases, the goal of the numerus clausus is simply to limit the number of students. That's not what I'm looking for. I'll keep reading it. I think it actually does touch on what I'm looking for a bit. In many cases, the goal of the numerus clausus is simply to limit the number of students to the maximum feasible in some particularly sought-after areas of studies with an intent to keep a constant supply of qualified workforce and thus limit competition. In historical terms, however, in some countries, numerus clausus policies were religious or racial quotas, both in intent and function. Countries legislating limitations on the admission of Jewish students at various times have included Austria, Canada, Hungary, Imperial Russia, Iraq, Latvia from 1934 under the Carlis Ulmanis regime, Netherlands, Poland, Romania, the United States, Vichy France, and Yugoslavia, among others. Back to the text. This initially reflected the new ruler's desire to appear as a, quote, genuine representative of the Polish people, and, quote, and their awareness of the popularity of the Żydo Komuna stereotype. In practical terms, however, it was not so much the administrative measures that made the daily life of Polish Jews difficult as the persisting popular prejudice and resentment. These were, however, quote, relics of the past, and, quote, believed to be destined to disappear in the process of building a new Polish socialist society and culture. The new regime's initial warm support for Israel did not last long. Israel soon became, in the Soviet view, a, quote, agent of American imperialism in the Middle East, and, quote, that is, it took the wrong Western side in the Cold War. Consequently, pro-Israel attitudes among the inhabitants of the Soviet bloc became highly suspect. Zionism was not just bad as a form of nationalism, but it now implied service to, quote, imperialism and, quote, world capitalism, most likely in the form of espionage on behalf of the CIA. Spying for imperialists was the major crime against one's country. Socialism and peace, clearly deserving the death penalty, as confirmed by the fate of 11 of the 14 defendants of the 1952 show trial of Rudolf Slansky and other, quote, Trotskyist, Titoist, Zionist, and bourgeois nationalist traitors, unquote, in communist Czechoslovakia. Moreover, the trial introduced, quote, anti-Zionism into the official vocabularies of communist regimes as a code name for any anti-Jewish speech and action. The term Zionism and Zionist no longer denoted Jewish nationalism, which the communists, including the Jewish communists, had long opposed, but became labels to be freely applied to any person of Jewish origin whom the regime targeted for attack. They became part of the communist Orwellian, quote, newspeak, their meaning flexible and threatening, their application ritual and instrumental, both determined by the party leadership. For this reason, I will place the terms Zionist, Zionism, and anti-Zionism in quotation marks whenever they are used in this particular totalitarian language. To be sure, quote, Zionism was not the only term that communist propaganda used freely for such labeling of enemies, real or imaginary. For example, the epithet, quote, fascist, could be applied to any political opinion or group so defined, socialists and conservatives included. The Slansky trial had relatively limited consequences in Poland. While the media reported on it extensively and propagated its hate speech, it did not generate any local mutation or arrests and executions. Jewish communists in high positions in the party administration and security apparatus were not removed. Although their influence seems to have gradually weakened, legitimate fears of an approaching anti-Jewish purge did not materialize. Such a purge again appeared most likely when the Soviet media announced in early 1953 the discovery of the, quote, doctor's plot, and, quote, to kill Soviet leaders. Fortunately, Stalin's actual death in March 1953 discontinued the campaign against the doctors who, as the organ of the Polish party claimed, quote, had been recruited by the international bourgeois nationalist Jewish organization Joint, a branch of the American intelligence, end quote. In the sphere of international relations, Poland also differed from the rest of the Soviet bloc. While in December 1952, Polish authorities declared the Israeli envoy a persona non grata, they did not sever diplomatic relations altogether. Thus, since February 1953, Poland remained the only country of the bloc that maintained relations with Israel. This proved helpful later when Polish diplomats assisted in the renewal of Soviet-Israeli relations. Footnote. As Zaremba notes, the anti-Jewish tone of the 1948 Soviet campaign against, quote, cosmopolitanism, and, quote, had surprisingly no follow-up in Poland. Back to the text. This proved helpful later when Polish diplomats assisted in the renewal of Soviet-Israeli relations. The relatively early change in party leadership in Poland may explain why the Polish regime did not follow the Czechoslovak example of struggle against, quote, Zionism in 1952. The Slansky trial was a late case of the bloc-wide pattern of replacing the communist leadership installed in the early post-World War II years as part of the intensified Sovietization process and the Stalin-Tito rift. This change took place in Poland in 1948 under the slogans of fighting, quote, the right-wing, bracket Polish, and bracket nationalist deviation, end quote. The losers were marginalized, some of them arrested, and at the time of the Slansky trial, they were still awaiting their own trial. Three aspects of the campaign against the, quote, right-wing nationalist deviation, end quote, deserve a mention here. First, the group that emerged triumphant and then led the Sovietization drive in the early 1950s included many communists who had spent the war in the Soviet Union. Among those, quote, Muscovites, end quote, prominent Jewish communists were unsurprisingly overrepresented. Those Polish Jews who had spent the war in the USSR, including deportees to Siberia, constituted the majority of Polish Holocaust survivors. Second, the communists who were targeted as, quote, right-wing nationalists, end quote, including their leader Vladislav Gomulka, survived the campaign. This point is not just to note the surprising leniency of the change of Polish leadership. Elsewhere in the bloc, the losers lost their lives, not just positions. Those accused of the, quote, deviation, end quote, returned to the political scene in 1956, having acquired popular sympathy as victims of the regime and Polish patriots who had tried to resist Soviet pressure. In 1968, some prominent supporters of the, quote, Anti-Zionist, end quote, campaign traced its origins to the 1948 crisis, and the campaign's favorite targets were Jewish Stalinists who had contributed to Gomulka's fall in 1948. The, quote, thaw, or the relaxation of terror, and the political shakeup in 1956 that ended the Stalinist period temporarily destabilized the Polish regime and brought another change of leadership. Gomulka returned to the highest party position, that of first secretary of the Central Committee of the Polish United Workers' Party, i.e. the Communist Party. Upon Gomulka's return, he faced a party leadership divided into two factions. The relatively reformist group, called Puławy, P-U-L-A-W-Y. Some of the leaders lived and met on Pulawska Street in Warsaw, including Jewish communists of the other faction known as Natalin, a palace in Warsaw suburbs where its leaders met. According to Wikipedia, the Puławians, or the Puławy faction, as they came to be informally dubbed, comprised one of two principal communist groupings in Stalinist Poland, which in the spring of 1956 followed the death of Boleslav Bierut, vied within the leadership of the Polish United Workers' Party, the PZPR. The Puławians were known during Poland's de-Stalinization process as reformists. The other, a hardliner grouping, were dubbed the Natalinians, or the Natolin faction. The Puławy faction included many communists of Jewish extraction. Among the most prominent were Roman Zambrovsky and Leon Kasman. Others included Stefan Szczejewski and Adam Schaff. However, the Puławians also included prominent party and state functionaries of Polish ethnicity, such as Edward Gierek, Peter Jarzewicz, Henryk Jablonski, Mieczysław Rakowski, Andrzej Werblin, Janusz Zaryski, Vladislav Matwin, Adam Rapaski, and Oscar Lange. The name, quote, Puławy faction came from the addresses of the Warsaw apartment buildings at Puławska Street 24 and 26, which had survived the Germans' planned destruction of Warsaw in World War II. The apartments were occupied mainly by high Communist Party officials, including supporters of the Puławy Street faction. The Natalin Palace faction called them by an uncomplimentary version of the word, quote, the Jews, unquote. Witold Jedliński describes the struggle between the Natalinians and the Puławians in his Simpletons and Yids. Some children of Puławians would later be involved in Poland's March 1968 political crisis. Bracket, further explanation needed, in bracket. Wikipedia says the Natalinians, or the Natalinian faction, were a grouping within the leadership of the Communist Polish United Workers' Party, PZPR, formed around 1956, shortly after the 20th Congress Party of the Soviet Union. Natalinians was named after the palace where its meetings were held in Warsaw's Natalin district. The main opposition to the Natalinians were the reformist Puławians, who included many PZPR members of Jewish extraction. The Natalinians opposed the post-Stalinist liberalization program, the Polish October, quote, thaw, and as part of their strategy to seek power, voiced simplistic nationalist and anti-Soviet slogans. The best-known Natalinians included Franciszek Żwajek, Viktor Kloziewicz, Zenon Nowak, Alexander Zawadzki, Franciszek Mazur, Vladislav Krusek, Kazimierz Mijal, Vladislav Dvorkovsky, and Hilary Chalchovsky. The Natalinian faction was also supported by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev because of their pro-Soviet stance. This isn't a very good article because it just said they boasted simplistic nationalist and anti-Soviet slogans, so take this with a grain of thought. After the 8th plenum of the Central Committee of the PZPR in October 1956, the Natalinians suffered a major setback when the first secretary of the PZPR, Vladislav Gomulka, chose to back and be backed by the Puławians. Both factions, the Natalinians and the Puławians, disappeared from the political scene in the late 1950s. Witold Jedliński described the struggle between the Natalinians and the Puławians in his booklet, Simpletons and Yids. Back to the text. Upon Gomulka's return, he faced a party leadership divided into two factions, the relatively reformist group called Puławy, since some of its leaders lived and met on Pulawska Street in Warsaw, including leading Jewish communists. The one faction, known as Natalin, a palace in Warsaw's suburbs where its leaders met, did not hesitate to exploit the ethnic argument against its rival, in particular blaming the Jews for the crimes of the Stalinist period. What is interesting here is the pattern of two opposing programs for renewal of the regime that emerged in this rivalry. Puławians tended to call for structural reforms while downplaying personal responsibility, i.e. they focused on how the regime operated rather than on who operated it. Natalinians downplayed structural deficiencies of the regime and tended to stress personal responsibility of their opponents. Both the proposed solutions were of course partial and insufficient, and their alternative false, yet by being expressed publicly at the top party level, they undermined a major taboo, opening the door for public criticism of the regime's rules or its rulers respectively. In 1968, the quote personalist and quote Natolin way of thinking would emerge again, together with the claims that Jews were responsible for the cruelties of the Stalinist period. In 1956, Gomulka tacitly cooperated with the Puławy group, but after a time he put his own people in key positions and under the slogan of fighting against Marxist and quote revisionism end quote, weakened his ex-allies. The broader context of the political games was reconsolidation of the regime after the shock of 1956, the smothering of reform tendencies within the party, the return of cultural and economic policies to their former course, but with the significant exception of collectivization, and Gomulka's increasing autocracy. In the 60s, a rising new force appeared on the political scene. The partisans, a rather loose group of party leaders and low-level activists united by similar political backgrounds, particularly their wartime experiences in the communist underground, hence their name, unappeased ambitions, and a worldview combining nationalism and communism under the unquestioned leadership of Mstislav Mosar, one of the quote right-wing nationalist end quote losers of 1948. Wikipedia says Mstislav Mosar lived from 1913 to 1986 and was a Polish communist politician who played a prominent role in the history of the Polish People's Republic. He is known for his unorthodox alternative socialist views attitude, known as endo-communism, which influenced Polish United Workers' Party politics in the late 1960s. During this time, Mosar and his supporters challenged Władysław Gomulka's authority. Mosar was heavily involved in the March 1968 events in Poland against Polish Jews, in which he led the faction of hardliners inside the Communist Party. It says, sorry, I'm looking if there's anything on this partisan group. On Mosar's Wikipedia, it says Mozart's main power base was the Communist Party faction called the, quote, partisans. Most of the, quote, partisans were men in their 40s and 50s who were veterans of the communist underground like Mozart himself. Mozart tended to play down the significance of the role of the home army while glorifying smaller pro-communist resistance movements. The, quote, partisans used Polish nationalism to gain support. Within the party, the enemy of the, quote, partisans was the, quote, Muscovite faction, Poles who had escaped to the Soviet Union during World War II and then returned with the Red Army. Some of the, quote, Muscovites were Polish Jews trained and supported by the Soviet Union who held important roles in the party and the secret police during the period of Stalinist terror. Mozart took advantage of this in his campaign, and in the mid-1960s, the nationalism of some of the, quote, partisans began to take on anti-Semitic tones. Back to the text. Mozart's position consolidated as he gradually took full control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, MSW, and its secret services, where he defeated his chief Jewish rival, Antoni Auster. According to Polish Wikipedia, Antoni Auster lived from 1903 to 1968 and was a Polish communist activist, member of the KPP, PPR, and PZPR, political officer in the Polish Army in the USSR, officer of the PRL security organs, head of the organizational department of the Central Committee of the PZPR, Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs, Deputy Minister of Municipal Economy, member of the KRN, the Legislative Sejm, SEJM, and the Sejm of the Polish People's Republic of Poland of the first term. Back to the text. Similar processes of gradual elimination of alleged alleged revisionist Jewish communists from important positions or their marginalization occurred in some other key institutions of the regime, certain sections of the party apparatus, the main political administration, GZP of the army, and the military secret services. The expressions of popular anti-Jewish attitudes suppressed during the Stalinist period reappeared in 1956. Archival evidence confirms grassroots prejudice, often including the Zyto-Kommunist stereotype, as well as exploitation and encouragement of the prejudice in the factional struggle. When the regime restabilized in 1957 to 58, the particular, quote, Jewish questioning, quote, of communist Poland, including the sensitive topics of wartime Polish-Jewish relations, the role of Jewish communists, and so on, was again censored out of the public discourse until 1967. In the 1960s, Poland maintained relatively good relations with Israel. In 1962, the countries upgraded their diplomatic missions to embassy status and trade increased. In 1966, Polish Foreign Minister Adam Rapaski invited his Israeli counterpart, Abba Eban, to Warsaw. Israel repeatedly expressed support for Poland on a most important issue, Poland's new western border, questioned by the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG. Wikipedia says Adam Rapaski lived from 1909 to 1970 and was a leading Polish communist politician and diplomat from 1947 to 1968. Adam Rapaski started in the socialist movement, but in 1948 joined the Central Committee of the new Polish United Workers' Party, PZPR, and became a member of its Politburo. He had very close ties to the Kremlin. He is best known for his 1957 proposal for the creation of nuclear-free zones in Europe. It was never adopted. He maintained good relations with East Germany while warning against West German expansionism. Peter Vandish considers that he was well-educated, cosmopolitan, pragmatic, liberal, and ambitious, and imbued with a sense of patriotism and belief in cooperation with the left in Western Europe. Wikipedia says Abba Eban lived from 1915 to 2002 and was a South African-born Israeli diplomat and politician and a scholar of the Arabic and Hebrew languages. During Abba Eban's career, he served as Foreign Affairs Minister, Education Minister, and Deputy Prime Minister of Israel. He was the second ambassador to the United Nations and the first permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations. He was also Vice President of the United Nations General Assembly and President of the Weizmann Institute of Science. Abba Eban famously remarked to the Palestinians, quote, "The Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity," end quote. Back to the text. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to see if there's anything on that border dispute, but I can't find there's probably something for it, I just can't find the good search terms. Can't think of them right now. Reportedly, Israeli assistance proved helpful in acquiring American credits, while for Israel, Poland appeared to be a good bridgehead for improving relations with the rest of the Soviet bloc, the USSR in particular. Nevertheless, the secret services of the MSW, the intelligence of the political police, SB, security service, were increasingly suspicious towards both Israel and Polish Jews, clearly not without the influence of their Soviet partners/masters. The fall of 1956 brought, among other things, a relaxation of the passport policy, resulting in a wave of emigration which embraced more than half of the total number of Polish Jews. Notably, many of the Jewish emigrants had just repatriated from the USSR. Thus, this was part of the Gomulka wave of emigration to Israel, was an indirect migration from the Soviet Union. The authorities tightened the grip on emigration again in the late 1950s, but the refusal rate among applicants for emigration permits to Israel was lower than to most Western countries. In 1966, as many as 67% of the applications were successful, 78% in 1965, compared with 38% of the applications to France and the United States, and just 19% to the FRG. Following the quote Gomulka wave and the limited emigration in the 1960s, on the eve of the Six-Day War, there remained probably some 25 to 30,000 Jews among Poland's more than 32 million inhabitants. The continuing outflow influenced the structure of the remaining Jewish population, as those less acculturated or adjusted to the socio-political regime were more prone to emigrate. Polish Jewry was thus decreasing in numbers, aging and assimilating. Its younger cohorts tended to secular Polish identities. It had no qualified rabbi, but it had impressively developed secular institutions. However incomparable they were with the richness of the Jewish life before the war, these institutions were much more active and richer than the institutions of any other ethnic minority. This was in large part the result of sizable foreign assistance, renewed after 1956, which other ethnic groups did not enjoy. From 1958 until 1966, the American Joint Distribution Committee, shortened as JOINT, earmarked almost $6 million for the Jewish community in Poland, which the MSW saw as clear evidence of subversive Western penetration. Wikipedia says American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JOINT or JDC, is a Jewish relief organization based in New York City. The organization has supported Jewish people living in Israel and throughout the world since 1914 and is active in more than 70 countries. The JDC offers aid to Jewish populations in Central and Eastern Europe as well as in the Middle East through a network of social and community assistance programs. In addition, the JDC contributes millions of dollars in disaster relief and development assistance to non-Jewish communities. Back to the text. The above outline shows how in the Polish People's Republic, various elements gradually accumulated that would contribute to the, quote, anti-Zionist, and quote, campaign in 1967 to 68, including popular anti-Jewish prejudice and resentment, Cold War hostility towards Israel and suspicion towards any sympathy for Israel, subordination to Moscow that was to make Poland take the Arab side in the distant conflict in the Middle East, a Soviet ready-made vocabulary of, quote, anti-Zionism, end quote, which enabled the popular anti-Jewish sentiment to be mobilized and exploited under an orthodox Marxist-Leninist camouflage, and the implicit tendency to extend the attack on Zionists to, quote, Zionists, end quote, and the legacy of the intra-party struggles and their Jewish aspect. The biggest factor, and easy to overlook because of its size, was the communist regime itself. The leviathan of the centralized bureaucratic party state, which controlled and monopolized the political sphere, the economy and media, with thousands of obedient apparatchiks, vigilant police officers and activists, ready to show devotion to any cause set by the party leaders, as well as non-party opportunists, conformists, and ordinary loyal citizens. In particular, this machinery had been well trained in running hate campaigns. Communist rulers and their propagandists had for years invested heavily in relevant institutions and training, and mastered their skills of inciting hatred. Aggressive propaganda and mobilization of the party and masses against real or imaginary enemies were such pervasive features of the Stalinist period that it can be seen as a permanent campaign with changing objectives. The anti-communist opposition in Tito, the Roman Catholic Church, and, quote, right-wing nationalist deviation, and, quote, kulaks and the Marshall Plan, and so forth. These hate campaigns were local mutations of the Soviet model, which had developed during the Great Purges and show trials of the 1930s, when communist hate speech had acquired its most elaborate and distinctive form. Reading and listening to this hate speech was a necessary element of education of young party activists in pre-1956 Poland. After 1956, the campaigns were less frequent and intense, yet they also bore the imprint of their Soviet forebears. Just a year prior to the anti-Israel campaign of 1967, a wave of protest and public condemnation was carefully prepared and carried out in earnest against the Catholic episcopate. In 1968, the quote, Anti-Zionist campaign had not yet come to an end before the propaganda machine targeted the reform movement in Czechoslovakia. According to AI Overview, in Catholicism, the episcopate refers to the office, rank, or body of bishops who hold the fullness of the sacrament of holy orders and are considered the successors of the apostles. Bishops are responsible for teaching, governing, and sanctifying the faithful within their assigned diocese and share in the responsibility for the governance of the entire church. The Pope, as the Bishop of Rome, heads the worldwide episcopate, which functions as a fundamental element of church governance. Back to the text. News section, June 1967. The anti-Israel campaign, intra-party conflict, and the quote, Zionist threat. The Israeli-Arab Six-Day War in 1967 marked a turning point in the policy of the Polish authorities towards Israel and the Jews in Poland. For several years, besides rather routine criticism of Israel's cooperation with quote, imperialism, both anti-Zionism and quote, anti-Zionism have been largely absent from the public discourse. Diplomatic representation was mutually raised to the embassy level, while Poland gave secret financial support to the Communist Party of Israel. In June 1967, anti-Zionism openly returned, while, quote, anti-Zionism, and quote, remained in the background for the time being. Initially, the party-controlled media provided rather limited information about the war, and news commentary was cautious, thus not particularly aggressive towards Israel. On the 6th of June, the Polish Politburo met to, quote, exchange views about the events in the Middle East, and, quote, and defined, quote, directives for informational propaganda work, end quote. The next day, the Polish government published a statement which, on behalf of the entire nation, condemned the perpetrators of this aggression and expressed complete support for the just struggle of the Arab countries. Immediately, the media filled with words of condemnation against the Israelis, along with expressions of solidarity with the peace-loving Arab nations. Propaganda, although aggressive, still remained within the regular limits of presenting adversaries from the other side of the Iron Curtain and targeted the Israeli government, not the Jews in general. On the 9th of June, Gomulka and Prime Minister Józef Cyrankiewicz, I don't know how to say their name, went to Moscow for a summit of communist leaders devoted to the Middle East crisis. Wikipedia says Józef Cyrankiewicz lived from 1911 to 1989 and was a Polish socialist and after 1948 communist politician. Józef Cyrankiewicz served as premier of the Polish People's Republic between 1947 and 1952, and again for 16 years between 1954 and 1970. He also served as chairman of the Polish Council of State from 1970 to 1972. Back to the text. The summit decided in favor of military and financial support for the Arab countries and the severance of diplomatic relations with Israel, which Romania rejected. One of the Polish eyewitnesses recalled this meeting as, quote, very dramatic, and quote, everything took place in a somewhat morose atmosphere. There was the feeling that our camp had undergone, in a certain sense, a military and political failure and lost prestige, ... During the meeting, unsettled information, bracket, on Arab defeats, and bracket, reached us, which put everyone in a discouraged mood, end quote. Soviet President Leonid Brezhnev's secret speech to the Soviet Central Committee on the 20th of June reveals much about the atmosphere in the Kremlin during those days. Quote, the caution of the moment, the speed with which the situation changed, the necessity of making decisions literally in the course of a few hours, important decisions regarding the vital interests of our country, the fate of war and peace, but put all of us under great stress. I must tell you, comrades, that the Politburo was working around the clock during those days, ... After receiving the report from Cairo describing the dramatic situation on the Egypt-Israeli front, we members of the Politburo met at 1 o'clock in the morning. We analyzed the possible options for assistance to the defeated UAR, United Arab Republic Army. On the 8th of June, in light of the existing situation, the leaders of the parties and governments of the European socialist governments agreed to meet without delay to discuss together the joint measures required to be undertaken in the current conditions. All this occurred, comrades, very quickly. Decisions were made by means of personal telephone calls to Central Committee secretaries and heads of governments. End quote. Brezhnev's secret speech. Having returned to Warsaw, Gomulka shared with other members of the Polish Politburo his mood of pessimism. Quote, the tense situation, ... will continue, and the possibility of new and more dangerous events cannot be excluded. A pretext for new aggression can always be found. That is why Romania's position is that much more shameful, ... The appetites of imperialism grow on local wars in which they can count on successes, ... We need to be prepared for a variety of surprises. Nuclear war hangs in the air, since the situation is inching the world to war. End quote. Gomulka. 27th of June, 1967. Such dramatic thinking clearly contributed to Gomulka's angry reaction to the news of the alleged pro-Israel attitude among Polish Jews, which he was repeatedly receiving from the MSW. Already the MSW report of the 6th of June noted, quote, we observe expressions of support for Israel, mainly among persons of Jewish origin, end quote. Other reports followed on the same note, quote, in the circles of the Jewish minority in Poland, and particularly among Jewish youth, there is a declared readiness to go to Israel to participate directly in the battle against the Arabs, end quote. Indeed, in Poland, one could hear opinions about the war that significantly departed from the official stance and tone conveyed by the media. The Western journalists and other independent observers noted expressions of sympathy for Israel and praise of its military successes, not only on the part of Jews. One such well-known expression was the reported remark that, quote, our Jews, bracket, from Poland, and bracket, beat their, bracket, Soviet-backed, and bracket, Arabs, end quote. Footnote. As confirmed by Professors Stefan Amsterdamski and Marcin Kula, eyewitnesses to the events, the MSW noted that in the city of Lodz there appeared leaflets proclaiming, quote, we support the struggle of Israel against the Red Arabs, end quote. End footnote. Gomulka also learned that some Polish Jews had celebrated Israeli victories, sent greetings to the Israeli embassy, and openly criticized the Polish and Soviet position on the conflict. Gomulka's secretary recalled that this news greatly irritated the PZPR leader. Quote, I know that it hurt Wisław, bracket Gomulka, in bracket, terribly. because he recognized that some of the comrades only formally (belonged) and to our community in the sense of their feeling of (common) and (interest), threat, and the like. That was very important for him, that certain comrades identified more with Israel than with the line of the party in terms of international politics. End quote. Interview with Saint Trzynski and W. Namiotkiewicz, 1983. Gomulka's sensitivity to the issue probably also resulted from the fact that the groups and persons reported by the MSW as disloyal were often close to certain party leaders who had been increasingly irritating Gomulka for some time. Moreover, he learned that the news on disloyalty among Polish Jews had reached Moscow too. Thus he had reasons of various kinds to react firmly. After hearing Gomulka's account of the meeting in Moscow, the Polish Politburo confirmed the decision to sever relations with Israel and to give military assistance to the Arab countries. When the Israeli ambassador left Warsaw several days later, a crowd of suspicious individuals, brought there undoubtedly by the MSW, made catcalls, which Polish radio described as the, quote, spontaneous reaction of the people of Warsaw, end quote. From then until the end of the communist period, Poland kept in line with the general Soviet bloc's anti-Israel policy in the international arena, including in the United Nations. It was no longer Poland but Romania that was the liaison country between Israel and the bloc. This anti-Israel line was compatible with increasing political and economic cooperation with Arab countries. I do not know of any archival evidence of any discussion on the topic of Polish-Israeli relations in either the party leadership or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not to speak of the Polish media. Clearly, since Moscow had decided on such a line, it seemed to be a topic outside their capacity. Roma locuta causa finita. That translates as, Rome has spoken, the cause is finished. It signifies, according to AI Overview, it says, it signifies that a decision by the Catholic papacy is final and ends a debate or discussion. While the phrase is often attributed to St. Augustine, who reportedly used a similar statement in a sermon concerning the Pelagian heresy. The exact wording doesn't appear in his writings, but the concept reflects the established authority of the apostolic see in the Church. Back to the text. It was only 23 years later, when Poland restored its sovereignty, that the first non-communist government of Poland renewed diplomatic relations with Israel. After the Politburo meeting, the media were evidently urged to intensify the anti-Israel campaign, as in a few days a new wave of aggressive articles reached the Polish public. The press emphasized the suffering of the Arab population and the alleged brutality of the Israeli army. A notable feature of many articles was their comparison of the Israeli army to the Nazi German army and news of the FRG's support for Israel. Their authors evidently enjoyed implying a pervasive Nazi Jewish affinity. This was not as shocking as it might seem today, as comparing Western, especially American governments and policies to Nazi ones was by no means unusual. Party officials responsible for the media were also fond of this theme, as their later documents repeat the directive to keep stressing the German-Israeli cooperation. Footnote. Tadeusz Waleszkowski, I don't know if I'm saying that right, an MSW officer who during the campaign advanced to the position of Deputy Director of MSW Department 3, became the main expert on the Israeli-German conspiracy. In just 18 months, his book, Israel and the FRG, ran into 5 Polish editions and 8 in foreign languages, while his similar publication, Israel, FRG, in Poland and Around the Israeli Aggression, were translated into 7 and 4 languages, respectively. End footnote. The media accompanied the wave of anti-Israel public protest organized throughout the country. Factory workers and employees of various offices and other institutions gathered at such meetings to express feelings and opinions entirely in accord with the party guidelines. They used very similar or indeed the same words and expressions. Quote, "We condemn the criminal aggression of Israel against the Arab nations. We condemn the barbaric methods used by the Israeli army against the civilian population," end quote, declared Henryk Zhaniowski, a worker at the Paris Commune plant. Speaking on behalf of his crew, quote, "The Israeli government became the tool of subjugation of other nations through British, American, and West German imperialists." End quote. 1,000 miners from the Stauzik mine passed a unanimous resolution demanding the immediate withdrawal of the Israeli forces from the Arab lands. The employees of the mechanic works and the transformer factory in Lodz expressed their cordial support for the Arab people. A female worker of the Uroda soap factory said to her colleagues, quote, "As a mother, it hurts me to see thousands of Arab women and children suffering from the misfortune brought by the Israeli aggression against the Arab people," end quote. Israel's aggression was also severely condemned by the workers at the Beton Stahl enterprise and the radio factory in Warsaw, the teachers of Rzeszów province, the employees of the truck factory in Starachowice, I don't know, and tens of thousands of others. This wave of meetings resulted from party mobilization as practiced for years. Its chronology shows the party modus operandi and its chain of command. First, the secretaries of the voivodeship, provincial committees, VC, and directors of central committee departments gathered at a conference in Warsaw where they listened to Gomulka's speech on the Middle East crisis, in which he condemned Israel as the, quote, outpost of imperialist interest, end quote, in the region. Gomulka claimed, however, that, quote, contrary to Arab nationalists, we support the existence of the Israeli state. We think that the slogan of liquidating Israel is wrong, end quote, Gomulka. The next VC apparatus transmitted instructions for action to the lower levels. This is how a party report presented this operation in Warsaw. Quote, on the 14th of June, a meeting was held by the members of the Warsaw Committee, the executives of the district committees, the secretaries of the workplace committees, the employees of the party apparatus, as well as the leadership of the Warsaw National Council, i.e. City Council, the trade unions and youth organizations. The first secretary of the VC, Stanislaw Kościołek, described the genesis and development of the conflict, the position of the Polish government, and the political repercussions against Israel. Attention was called to the imperialist propaganda as well as the tasks of the party organizations. The present main task, resulting from the resolution of the 18th plenum of the Central Committee, is the summoning of meetings in party organizations, explaining the essence of the events in the Middle East, as well as the strengthening of active struggle with subversive propaganda and attempts to sow seeds of political chaos, ... After conferences of secretaries of basic party organizations in the district committees, that followed, meetings in the basic organizations began. Mass meetings take place in Warsaw workplaces and institutions, and provide a forum to express support for the PRL's position with regard to Israel's aggression in the Middle East, and condemn Israel's aggressive, provocative, and imperialist policy in the Middle East directed against the Arab countries, end quote. The party machine worked smoothly, producing the requested results, although a closer look at the photographs in the meeting reveals faces that are more tired or bored than angry. The campaign's high point was Gomulka's appearance at the Trade Union Congress on the 19th of June. He delivered a 20-page speech, mainly a lecture on the history of Israel and its entry into a, quote, entente with British-American imperialists against the progressive Arab forces, end quote. This would have been just another of his long and boring speeches if it were not for a paragraph where he referred to the, quote, fifth column, end quote, a synonym for enemy infiltration. Quote, Israel's aggression in the Arab countries met with applause in Zionist circles of Jews, Polish citizens, end quote. The Polish authorities treat all citizens equally regardless of their ethnicity, he claimed, quote, but we do not want a fifth column to emerge in our country. We cannot remain indifferent towards people, ... who support the aggressor, end quote. He also unambiguously urged that, quote, those who feel that these words are addressed to them, end quote, should emigrate. The audience greeted these words with applause. A few of the Politburo members present, Edvard Ochab, Eugeniusz Gier, Stefan Jedrzejowski, and Adam Lepaski, were clearly surprised by and unhappy with precisely this fragment of the speech. Ochab put it bluntly, quote, you had no right to come forth with such a thesis. You had no right without the consent of the Politburo, end quote. Ochab was evoking an unwritten rule that the official speeches of the first secretary were passed among the members of the Politburo for their remarks. This was not a minor issue, as the rule expressed the, quote, collective leadership, end quote, principle, which parties of the Soviet bloc had introduced following Nikita Khrushchev's critique of Stalin's rule as a remedy against the, quote, cult of the individual, end quote. The reason for departure from this rule, according to Gomulka himself and his secretary, was trivial and irrelevant to the controversial contents of the text. Lack of time and the absence from Warsaw of the majority of the Politburo members before the 19th of June. Ochab did not believe this explanation, and there are good reasons to share Ochab's suspicion. Ochab and other contenders must have been really angry, as under their pressure Gomulka agreed to alter the text of his speech for official publication. The sentence about the fifth column disappeared, while words moderating the tone of the fragment were added. This was quite unprecedented. The authoritarian first secretary had agreed to censor a speech he had already delivered! Exclamation point. As participants in the Congress and those who had listened to the speech on the radio knew the original version, this extraordinary fact could not pass ignored. In Moscow, the 19th of June speech was well received. The Soviet press published it, the amended version, and Brezhnev himself personally praised Gomulka, confirming that his evaluation of the events was consonant with that of the Soviet Politburo. A comment is in order here that the Soviets praised the Polish leaders for their correct approach to the, quote, problem of Zionism, end quote, and their determined action in March 1968 afterwards, but there is no evidence that they had encouraged them to such action in advance. In the notes from several Polish Soviet meetings at the highest level that took place between June 1967 and March 1968, the topic of the Middle East was raised several times, but no mention was made, or at least recorded, about the domestic, quote, Zionists. The speech opened an essentially new phase of the campaign, These sentences by the first secretary introduced the word, quote, Zionism that had augured ill for Jews since the 1950s. The anti-Israel became anti-Zionist, possibly, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, and the Cold War crisis in the Middle East acquired a local Polish-Jewish dimension. At the same time, the clash between Gomulka and the outraged Politburo members crystallized a serious division inside the party leadership, which is not limited to that single issue. Quote, a very important tension appeared at that point within the leadership, ... a very significant matter, end quote, as Gomulka's secretary later recalled. What the issue was can only be surmised. The charisma that Gomulka had enjoyed in 1956 had long eroded. His authoritarian style of ruling and his economic and cultural policies had been increasingly difficult to accept for some members of the leadership. At the next Politburo session, Gomulka defended his stance on the alleged disloyalty. Quote, regarding the situation that existed in the country during the period of Israel's aggression and the dangerous symptoms which were reported to us, I consider appropriate to stand out against the germ of the fifth column. A very important problem has developed, which we cannot overlook. These are matters that affect our entire country, our existence, and there must be clarity in these matters. With regard to people who have two souls and two fatherlands, conclusions must be drawn, end quote. Vladislav Gomulka. In June 1967, the opposition in the Politburo prevented the unleashing of an open, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, campaign. The propaganda did not reproduce the sentence on the, quote, fifth column, end quote, nor did it take up the theme of, quote, Zionists in Poland, end quote. But behind the scenes, in fields and through channels outside the control of the opponents of the, quote, anti-Zionism, end quote, theme, different messages started to circulate which, as we know today, prepared the ground for a future campaign. Gomulka's words were a signal for those who had long been awaiting it. After all, in General Mosar's Ministry of Internal Affairs, having repeatedly provided party leaders with information on alleged Jewish disloyalty, they now received the desired feedback. The MSW leadership had no doubts about the treacherous inclinations of Polish Jews. Some of its directors had for a long time pointed to the, quote, Zionist threat, end quote. Their report, summarizing the reactions to the Six-Day War in Poland, accused not only individual Jews but Jews in the most general terms. Quote, Polish Jews should show solidarity with the Israeli aggressors, praise the Israeli army and the policy of the Israeli government, end quote. And worst of all, they, quote, expressed themselves critically and often inimically about the policy of the party and the authorities of the PRL, the Soviet Union, and other socialist countries, end quote. The Security Service reported that 81 Polish citizens had volunteered for the Israeli army, while others had transferred savings and sent greetings of solidarity to representatives of the Israeli embassy. Among the 382 Jews allegedly displaying pro-Israel attitudes were 76 journalists and writers, 51 individuals in upper managerial positions in the administration, 46 scholars, and 36 lawyers. The reporters visibly tended to contrast the attitudes of the Jews with the rest of society, quote, the working class, the peasants and the intelligentsia, as well as the non-Jewish ethnic minorities almost universally expressed support for the position of the party and the government, ... Polish society generally responded in favor of the Arab side against the Israeli aggressor, end quote. The report strongly denied it could be otherwise and claimed that information about the pro-Israel sympathies of Poles, quote, spread by Zionist and enemy foreign agencies, end quote, were deliberate misinformation. Fragmentary evidence shows that the theory of a Jewish threat had been ripening inside the MSW for a few years. One may suppose that the Soviet influence had contributed to its development. Well before June 1967, Vice Minister Franciszek Zalotchik claimed that the, quote, USA exploits three forces against the socialist countries: Roman Catholic clergy, the FRG, and Zionism, end quote. Franciszek Zalotchik. I'm not really seeing anything for this person. Back to the text. Franciszek Zalotchik saw a Jewish conspiracy behind the ferment among the intelligentsia. For example, behind such dissidents as Jacek Kuron and Karol Modzelewski, there was an alleged, quote, conceiving and instigating group, end quote, entirely composed of Jewish intellectuals. I have the piece, Open Letter to the Party, by Jacek Kuron and Karol Modzelewski, if you're interested. The paranoid thinking of the security officers appears most clearly in their expressed conviction that pro-Israel attitudes among Polish Jews could not appear spontaneously, but, quote, undoubtedly had their origins in the resolution of the World Jewish Congress in Brussels and the World Zionist Organization in Jerusalem, ... In recent years, the Jewish minority was actively penetrated by representatives of the international Zionist organizations and the Israeli embassy, end quote. MSW Collegium Protocol, 8th of June, 1967. An even stronger conspiracy theory is presented by a note of the 1st of July, 1967. The paranoid thinking of the security officers appeared most clearly in their expressed conviction that pro-Israel attitudes among Polish Jews could not appear spontaneously, but, quote, wait, I already read that. Fuck. I'll keep reading it. Quote, undoubtedly had their origins in the resolutions of the World Jewish Congress in Brussels and the World Zionist Organization in Jerusalem, ... In recent years, the Jewish minority was actively penetrated by representatives of the International Zionist Organization and the Israeli Embassy, end quote. In seeking sources for the paranoid vision of, quote, the Zionists, in seeking sources for the paranoid vision of the, quote, Zionists, end quote, in March 1968, we need to take into consideration not only anti-Semitic stereotypes, but also the secret police's partiality for conspiracy theories and a more widespread, quote, detectivist materialism, end quote, which had found fertile ground in Soviet-dominated communist parties. After the Six-Day War and the clash inside the Politburo, such thinking found political support at the top party level. General Kazimierz Witejewski, a hardliner who supervised the MSW on behalf of the party authorities, now encouraged its directors to, quote, get to the party leadership in order to set forth these issues once again, end quote, parenthesis, that is, to make the, quote, Zionist problem, end quote, a top political issue, in order to help, quote, our party purge itself of incidental and undesirable elements, end quote. According to Polish Wikipedia, Kazimierz Witejewski lived from 1906 to 1992. Kazimierz Witejewski was a Polish communist and military activist, Major General of the Polish People's Army, head of the main political board of the Polish Army, president of Lodz from January to March 1945, member of the State National Council, the legislative Sejm, the Sejm of the Polish People's Republic of the first term. End footnote. Or, excuse me, back to the text. Whether this was Kazimierz Witaszewski's own initiative or whether he spoke on behalf of some party leaders remains unclear. Certainly, raising the topic would contribute to weakening the position of Ohab and other Politburo members who had opposed Gomulka on the 19th of June, as well as those critical of the growing power of Mosar and his men. Summarizing the discussion of the MSW directors on the 28th of June, Mosar defined the Jews as infected with dangerous, quote, Zionism, indicated them as a collective object for particular scrutiny, and gave the priority to the struggle with, quote, Zionism, thus understood. The anti-Israel campaign, which Gomulka transformed into an anti-Zionist one, through Mosar's guidelines, acquired a secret and clearly anti-Jewish dimension. The Secret Service followed his orders for, quote, in-depth investigation of certain fields of our administration and economy. It must be discovered, for example, who is planted in such fields as the State Reserves, nuclear science, the Polish press agency, ... and pressure must be put on the executives in these departments to get rid of undesirable people, end quote. This was a recommendation to prepare for a purge. In fact, such preparations had already begun, as shown by an MSW document on the 26th of June, which calculated the number of Jews in key government agencies, putting the figure at 700 out of 3,500 employees. The minister reminded those assembled of the subordinate role of the MSW vis-a-vis the party. Quote, it is the party leadership which decides who gets to go to which post, ... Nevertheless, we need to convince the comrades, the employees of the MSW, that their work cannot be in vain, and if results do not come today, then tomorrow, end quote. These words had the power of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The immediate consequences of the meeting in the MSW was the joint request of the MSW and the CC Administrative Department to the party authorities to block financial assistance from the joint to Jewish organizations in Poland. The matter was quickly placed on the agenda of the CC Secretary, which approved the recommendations with no objections. The Jewish community lost its major source of income, which meant the inevitable elimination of a significant portion of its social, educational, and cultural activity, and a serious blow to Jewish cooperatives. Simultaneously, a special party task force, supported by information from the MSW, evaluated the attitudes of a number of journalists with regard to the Middle East conflict. By the 4th of July, it had examined 15 journalists in Warsaw, and in the majority of cases recommended dismissals or party penalties. The highest-ranking victim of this action was the executive editor of the party organ, Tribuna Luda, Leon Kasman, who most likely tried to protect his employees from charges of pro-Israel sympathy. Tribuna Ludu, People's Tribune, was one of the largest newspapers in communist Poland, which circulated between 1948 and 1990, is the official media outlet of the Polish United Workers' Party, along with the televised news program Dźwięk. Back to the text. Leon Kasman, who's this? Wikipedia says Leon Kasman was a Polish communist journalist and politician of Jewish descent, head of the propaganda and agitation department of the Central Committee of the Polish Workers' Party. He was first editor-in-chief of Tribuna Ludu Daily, deputy of the Sejm of the Polish People's Republic. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It's SEJM, which is the lower house of the bicameral Republic, Poland. I don't know. As a result of the conflicts with the Communist Party, Kasman resigned from his function in December 1953. He was among the Pulaviani faction in the PZPR. Leon Kasman died in 1984 and was buried at the Powązki Military Cemetery in Warsaw. In December 1967, when a special party designation directly ordered Leon Kasman to fire his deputy and a few other employees, Kasman resigned. Yet the MSW's recommendations, quote, to get rid of undesirable people, end quote, were not successful in every case. For example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, about which the MSW directors had spoken most critically, would not be purged until spring 1968. Another example of a, quote, purge and suspension, end quote, was against the editors of the PVN publishing house, who were accused of downplaying wartime Polish suffering and with disproportionate focus on the fate of the Jews in their great universal encyclopedia. It may have well been the difficulties the MSW encountered in removing, quote, Zionists in some institutions in 1967 that contributed to its pressure for a general anti-Jewish purge in March 1968. Wikipedia says PWN, the Polish Scientific Publishers, is a Polish book publisher founded in 1951 when it split from the Wydawnictwa Szkolna I Pedagogicna. Adam Bromberg, who was the enterprise's director between 1953 and 1965, made it into Communist Poland's largest publishing house. The printing house is best known as a publisher of encyclopedias, dictionaries, and university handbooks. It is the leading Polish provider of scientific, educational, and professional literature, as well as works of reference. It authored the Wielka Encyclopedia Powszechna, PWN, by then the largest Polish encyclopedia, as well as its successor, the Wielka Encyclopedia PWN, which is published between 2001 and 2005. There is also an online PWN encyclopedia. Initially state-owned since 1991, it has been a private company. The company is a member of the International Association of Scientific, Technical, and Medical Publishers, STM. On the 1st of April 2022, not relevant. Back to the text. It may well have been the difficulties the MSW encountered in removing, quote, Zionists in some institutions in 1967 that contributed to pressure for a general anti-Jewish purge in March 1968. A separate current of the campaign in 1967 consisted of developments in the army. After the outbreak of the Six-Day War, orders to increase political vigilance, and the official condemnation of Israel as a U.S.-sponsored aggressor, there was naturally increasing suspicion towards Jews in the army. As the head of the military main political authority, GZP, later reported, quote, party organizations exhibited political maturity, vigilance, and an uncompromising attitude, and excluded from their ranks those who were for imperialism against socialism, end quote. 63 party members were given party penalties for pro-Israel attitudes, and 41 were expelled. During the anti-Israel campaign in the armed forces, The GZP sent to the garrisons to lecture on the conflict a group of speakers who clearly incited anti-Jewish emotions and openly or implicitly accused Polish Jewish officers of dual loyalty. The atmosphere at some party meetings in the army was simply hysterical. For example, at a meeting in the Modlin base, certain participants claimed that Israel had received $100 million from Polish Jews, and that some top-ranking officials and officers had committed state treason. They demanded that the, quote, two-faced individuals, and, quote, be removed from state and military positions, and even proposed to turn to the Soviet Union for help in rebuilding the Polish army. After a series of such meetings in the Air Defense Forces, officers, party activists organized something close to a mutiny, demanding dismissals of the allegedly pro-Israel officers, including their commander, General Czeslaw Mankiewicz. Polish Wikipedia says Czeslaw Mankiewicz lived from 1920 to 1990 and was a major general of the Polish army in the years 1962 to 67 and commander of the National Air Defense Forces, WOPK. Back to the text. Their accusation of Mankiewicz was based on sheer rumors and the fact that he had a Jewish wife. Reacting to this discipline crisis, the GZP sent a special commission to the WOPK, but instead of chastening the insubordinate ranks, the commission supported their demands. The key moment in these incidents was a late-night conference on the 6th of July, when Minister of Defense Marian Spychalski agreed to dismiss Mankiewicz. Who was one of his most loyal colleagues. Wikipedia says Marian Marek Spychalski lived from 1906 to 1980 and was a Polish architect in pre-war Poland and later military commander and a communist politician. During World War II, Marian Spychalski belonged to the Polish underground forces operating within Poland and was one of the leaders of the People's Guard, then People's Army. Marian Spychalski had held several key political posts during the PRL era, most notably chairman of the Council of State, mayor of Warsaw, and defense minister. Back to the text. Experts on relations in the army at that time agreed that the main promoters of the WOPK purge were Generals Theodor Kufel and Josef Urbanowicz. Wikipedia says Theodor Kufel lived from 1920 to 2016. Theodor Kufel was a Polish military and political activist. During World War II, he was active in the anti-Nazi movement. After the war, he served as a general in the Polish People's Army. From 1964 to 1979, he was commander of the Internal Military Service. Wikipedia says Josef Urbanowicz lived from 1916 to 1989 and was a Polish and Soviet general and political figure. Urbanowicz served as the head of the main political directorate of the Polish Army from 1967 to 1971 and Vice Minister of Defense of the Polish People's Republic 1968 to 1984. Back to the text. Both Theodor Kufel and Josef Urbanowicz were intriguers, proponents of the struggle against, quote, revisionist Zionist elements, end quote, i.e. Jews and supporters of reforms, and trusted in Moscow. Urbanovich had been a Soviet officer who acquired Polish citizenship only in 1954. It might be more than a coincidence that the two institutions most involved in initiating the purge in the army, the military counterintelligence and the GZP, were also the two most closely supervised and most likely infiltrated by the Soviets. Dismissals in the WOPK began a broader purge in the armed forces, targeting people, quote, holding political opinions divergent from the position of the PRL government as well as the party line, and for the loss of the moral political values required of an officer of the People's Polish Army, end quote. Jews constituted only a portion of those dismissed under this systematic, quote, review of cadres, end quote, which is the culmination of a long-standing trend of removing officers unreliable from Moscow's point of view. In total, some 150 officers of Jewish origin were dismissed from the service in 1967 to 68. This meant almost all of them, since according to Colonel Michał Czesinski, the number of Jews in active service in 1967 was no more than 200, even according to the broadest criteria. Michał Czesinski lived from 1924 to 2011 and was the officer of the Polish People's Republic military counterintelligence. What did they just say about him? The number of Jews in active service in 1967 was no more than 200, even according to the broadest criteria. He died in 2016 in Haifa, in northern Israel. New section. The campaign of March 1968. The full-scale, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, campaign began in March 1968. In Polish historiography, the events of spring 1968 are often simply referred to as, quote, March. And for many people, the term is synonymous with an anti-Semitic witch hunt. The campaign that began in March included aggressive anti-Jewish propaganda, barely covered with the fig leaf of, quote, anti-Zionism, end quote, mass mobilization against, quote, the enemies of socialist Poland, end quote, and large-scale expulsion of Jews from the party, government posts, and other positions. The campaign acquired these features in the course of just a few days, reaching its most intense period in 2 weeks, and continuing for the next few weeks, until the party leadership sought to restrain it and it began to lose impetus. The, quote, anti-Zionist campaign was secondary to the main chapter of the March events, which consisted of a student rebellion and its pacification by the authorities. Street riots broke out when police and groups of the party, active, armed with clubs, brutally attacked a student rally at Warsaw University on the 8th of March. The students were protesting against the censoring of a drama by the 19th century Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz. Some party hardliners found the drama anti-Soviet, and in solidarity with their colleagues who had been dismissed from the university for violating the protest a few weeks earlier. According to Wikipedia, Adam Bernard Mickiewicz, I'm not sure how to say it, lived from 1798 to 1855 and was a Polish poet, dramatist, essayist, publicist, translator, and political activist. Mickiewicz is regarded as the national poet in Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus. He also largely influenced Ukrainian literature and affected Russian literature. A principal figure in Polish Romanticism, he is one of Poland's, quote, three bards, and is widely regarded as Poland's greatest poet. Adam Mickiewicz is also considered one of the greatest Slavic and European poets, has been dubbed a quote, Slavic bard. A leading romantic dramatist, he has been compared in Poland and Europe to Byron and Goethe. Why don't I just look his name up? Let's see if I can do that.
Adam Mickiewicz.
Adam Mickiewicz.
Adam Mickiewicz.
Adam Mickiewicz. Okay. Where the hell am I? Mickiewicz. Why didn't I do that earlier? I'm looking him up earlier. Where am I? A leading romantic dramatist, Adam Mickiewicz was compared in Poland and Europe to Byron and Goethe. He is known chiefly for the poetic drama Ziadi, Forefathers' Eve, and the national epic poem Pantadyusz. His other influential works include Konrad Wallenrod and Rosina. All these served as inspiration for uprising against the three imperial powers that had partitioned the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth out of existence. Mickiewicz, what is his name again? Mickiewicz?
Adam Mickiewicz.
Mickiewicz. Right. Adam Mickiewicz was born in the Russian partitioned territories of the former Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which had been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and was active in the struggle to win independence. For Adam Mickiewicz.
Adam Mickiewicz.
Adam Mickiewicz, and was active in the struggle to win independence for Adam Mickiewicz's home region. After, as a consequence, spending 5 years exiled in Central Russia in 1829, Adam Mickiewicz succeeded in leaving the Russian Empire and, like many of his compatriots, lived out the rest of his life abroad. Adam Mickiewicz settled first in Rome, then in Paris, where for a little over 3 years he lectured on Slavic literature at the Collège de France. He was an activist striving for a democratic and independent Poland. Adam Mickiewicz died probably of cholera at Istanbul in the Ottoman Empire, where he had gone to help organize Polish forces to fight Russia in the Crimean War. In 1890, his remains were repatriated from Montmorency, Val d'Oise in France to Wawel Cathedral in Krakow, Poland. Back to the text. The brutal intervention at Warsaw University had not put an end to the rebellion but made it spread. In the following days in Warsaw and other academic centers, there were numerous protest meetings, student strikes, and street riots to which the authorities responded with police clubs, arrests, expulsions from the universities, and conscription into the army. By the 27th of March, the police had arrested 2,591 persons, including 597 students, while more than 600 students had been called up to the army and assigned to separate units in distant garrisons. Repression continued for the next few months. The quote Zionists appeared on the scene quite unexpectedly. 3 days after the riots had begun, an article appeared in a minor newspaper accusing them of having instigated the rebellion. From that point onward, the quantity and intensity of attacks against, quote, Zionism, and, quote, snowballed in the media and in public speeches. Of course, no proof of any, quote, Zionist conspiracy, and, quote, behind the youth rebellion has been found. The claim is one of the factors endowing March with its murky, grotesque character. For its proponents, the undeniable proof was the relatively numerous participation of Jews, as defined by Nuremberg standards, among the leaders of the student protest. The opening of the MSW archives after 1989 has made it possible to trace this, quote, Zionist explanation, and, quote, to the security service. The MSW reports evidently exaggerated the role of Jewish students and children of known party figures in the rebellion. As in the case of the report, on June 1967, we cannot ascertain if this was an initiative of Mossar and his men, again intended to manipulate the party leaders against the, quote, Zionists, or a manipulation requested by some members of the leadership. In any case, the reports provided a basis for decisions to launch a major hate campaign with the, quote, Zionists among its principal targets. Propaganda connected them with, quote, bankrupt politicians, and, quote, who bore, quote, the responsibility for errors and lawlessness of the Stalinist period, and, quote, and were trying to return to power. To make it even more frightening and detestable, this Zionist-Stalinist conspiracy was depicted as having strong international backing in the Israeli-West German secret deal to cleanse the Germans of their criminal past and shift the responsibility for the extermination of 6 million Jews onto the Polish nation. Together with the eruption of the hate speech in the media, a wave of rallies started, quote, in support of Comrade Gomulka against the instigators of riots, end quote, organized by every voivodeship party secretary as well as by hundreds of party organizations at the lower levels. The thousands of such meetings sent resolutions and letters to the leadership in an increasingly radical tone, quote, we swear in memory of those who died for power to the people that we will claim from Polish soil with our workers' fists all the instigators and leaders of the coup against the working class and peasant government. We will not permit revisionist and Zionist rioters to accuse us of anti-Semitism, end quote. Declared the workers from the Pulver factories, while the workers from the Beldon steelworks demanded a purge of Zionist elements from party ranks, their removal from their positions, and the expulsion of their children from the universities. The largest rally gathered a crowds reportedly numbering 100,000 people, brought to Katowice from the entire Upper Silesia.
Katowice.
Katowice. Katowice, that's how you say it. Anyway, brought to Katowice from the entire Upper Silesia. Let me see if I'm saying that right.
Silesia. Silesia.
Silesia. Oh, I'm saying that wrong. Silesia. Anyway, where am I? Fuck. The largest rally gathered a crowd reportedly numbering 100,000 people brought to Katowice from the entire Upper Silesia.
Silesia.
With banners bearing slogans such as, quote, "Down with Zionism, the agent of imperialism," quote, "Writers to their pens, students to their studies," quote, "Purge the party of Zionists," quote, "We'll cut off the head of the anti-Polish Hydra," end quote. Edward Gierek, the party boss of Silesia, God damn it,
Silesia.
thundered, quote, "It's not difficult to figure out who's behind the organization of the brawls in Warsaw and everywhere else in our country. It's the same frustrated and disappointed enemies of people's Poland, ... revisionist Zionist servants of imperialism," end quote. Gierek. The people he named as the enemies were a strange group made up of the Jewish communist Roman Zambrowski, Stefan Stasevsky, once powerful men in the party and vigorous Stalinist, and the Catholic writers Stefan Kizilevsky and Pavel Yasiniska, known for their independence and courage. Gomulka appeared in public as late as the 19th of March at a meeting with a few thousand party activists in Warsaw, accompanied by all the Politburo members. Participants bore banners with slogans such as, quote, "Down with the agents of imperialism, reactionary Zionism," end quote. And, quote, "We demand a complete unmasking and punishment of the political instigators," end quote. Gomulka delivered a speech primarily attacking disobedient intellectuals, Kizilevsky, Yazienska, Yazienika, Antonio Slonimsky in particular. He devoted a relatively small fragment of his speech to the, quote, "Zionists," and denied that Zionism was a danger for Poland. He pointed to an alleged identity problem among Jews who were more attached to Israel than to Poland. Quote, "I presume that Jews in this category will sooner or later leave our country," end quote, Gomulka said. He also distinguished between cosmopolitans, quote, "who feel neither Poles nor Jews," end quote, and good, quote, "citizens of Jewish origin, ... for whom Poland is the only homeland," end quote. Gomulka reassured the audience that the party would, quote, "oppose with complete firmness every manifestation of anti-Semitism," end quote. Gomulka. This decision is, of course, difficult to square with so many hostile and openly anti-Jewish messages in the media and at the party-organized meetings. Clearly, in the spring of 1968, the party had other priorities than opposing anti-Semitism. The massive verbal and symbolic attack in the media and at the meetings provided the background for a purge. Its first target was the most prominent member of the former Puławy faction, Roman Zambrowski, a man who had been a devoted communist for 40 years. A former key member of the Politburo, once served as the Central Committee's powerful secretary, Speaker of the Parliament and government minister, Zambrowski lost party membership and then his position by a decision, evidently inspired, of his local party cell. In his absence and following baseless accusations, news of Zambrowski's dismissal sent a clear message. If such a prominent figure was defenseless, any, quote, "Zionist" could be attacked. Soon several other high-ranking Jewish officials lost their posts, and a nationwide purge of, quote, "Zionists," quote, "revisionists," and other, quote, "alien elements," end quote, from the party, and their positions quickly gathered momentum, descending from top government officials and editors-in-chief to university professors, bookkeepers in cooperatives, teachers in elementary schools, and factory foremen. The unbearable atmosphere of a witch hunt made many other Jews and Poles of Jewish origin decide to leave. Between 1968 and 1970, some 13,000 persons, i.e. half of the estimated total number of Jews, applied for emigration permits to Israel. Gomulka's claim that, quote, Zionists would, quote, sooner or later leave our country, end quote, was another self-fulfilling prophecy. The, quote, Zionist was not the only enemy of the unfolding propaganda campaign, yet it appeared the primary one. As a distinguished analyst of the language of propaganda wrote, quote, behind everything evil in the world, enemies of every kind, emerges the face of the Jew called a Zionist, end quote. Notably, quote, Zionist meant Jew even if the person so called was not Jewish by any standard, since the, quote, Anti-Zionist, end quote, campaign targeted some ethnic Poles as well, none could feel safe. The, quote, Anti-Zionist current of the campaign contained old anti-Semitic cliches, new, quote, socialist charges, or old ones recycled. The old accusations could have been, and sometimes actually were, copied from pre-war anti-Semitic literature. As Mstislav Rakovsky, the editor of the relatively liberal weekly Polityka, noted in his diary, quote, if there is a hell, all Polish anti-Semites must be enjoying this moment. The communists are doing what generations of Polish chauvinists had fought for, end quote. The second kind of accusation reflected new types of crimes, such as Marxist revisionism or solidarity with a Cold War enemy. Muddy newspeak facilitated the translation of the old chauvinist charges against the Jews into new, quote, socialist accusations. For example, by proving that, quote, cosmopolitanism is not only anti-patriotism, but also and above all else anti-socialism, since it opposes an explicitly classless society in which there is no room for the bourgeoisie and ideological speculation, end quote. In the absence of other good arguments, one could always be accused of lack of enthusiasm and insufficient support for the, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, campaign itself. Conspiracy theories spread freely, and they seem to have found many receptive ears. Quote, Zionist plots in Poland were said to have some hidden connection with the Jewish conspiracy in the West, where the headquarters of the, quote, World Zionist Mafia, end quote, was located. The Joint Distribution Committee, the World Jewish Congress, B'nai B'rith, were in essence agents of the CIA, Israeli intelligence, or the most secret, quote, Zionist center. Paradoxically, probably the most powerful slogan of the March propaganda was the recycled claim of Zydo Kommuna, or Jewish communism. That is to say, accusing the Jews that they were zealous communists to blame for most, if not all, crimes and horrors of the Stalinist period. This accusation exploited and developed the popular stereotype. The Jews are not just communists, they are the dark side of communism, responsible for whatever is wrong with communism. The claim both compromised the Jews and absolved other communists from their crimes and misdeeds, as well as implying that ethnic cleansing of the party would make the regime better. Evidently, Jewish communists were for the party the best scapegoat available. Externalizing evil onto the Jews was also a most welcome gift to all those who felt somehow uneasy serving the regime, for which many Poles, and maybe for themselves, was alien, imposed by the Soviets, atheists, and stained with the blood of war heroes and innocent victims, or at least economically inefficient and full of absurdities. Similarly, a most useful feature of the March enemy was his alleged elitist nature. He was presented as belonging to some kind of exclusive political, financial, or cultural establishment. He was detached from the people and held the ordinary man in contempt. Clothing, quote, anti-Zionism, and, quote, an egalitarian costume, such accusations were instrumental in attracting to the campaign many such ordinary people who had no special resentment against the Jews. In March, the rituals that channeled discontent and aggression, the rulers let their subjects break certain taboos which in ordinary times had been unthinkable. The Poles were permitted, even encouraged, to express loudly their dissatisfaction with and criticism of the regime and its functionaries, on condition, however, that they used the rhetoric of condemning, quote, Zionists, revisionists, and so forth. This means that in 1968, after years of fearful silence, Poles are allowed to criticize the corruption and arrogance of the officials. Not all of them, it is true, only the Jewish ones. They could even throw off submission to their superiors, but not all of them. In this regard, the popularity of criticism of, quote, Zionism as members of the establishment seemed to have been no accident. The egalitarian charges made against them of alienation, arrogance, unjustified privileges, and so on were basically directed at the PRL establishment as a whole. Therefore, the, quote, Anti-Zionism, and, quote, of 1968 appears to have been more than a mere camouflage for attacking the Jews. Despite the brutal and unsophisticated methods of the campaign, quote, Anti-Zionism, and, quote, served as a complex and subtle code, using its language as first of all a sign of obedience and loyalty to the party. Conspicuous, quote, Anti-Zionism indicated a particular devotion or belonging to or willingness to join the victorious and hopefully rising group, as many observers in 1968 perceived the partisans and their followers. At the same time, quote, Anti-Zionism could express frustration with and resentment against various features of the regime or the grim reality of everyday life in people's Poland. Furthermore, the favorite topic of, quote, Zionist plots and hidden Jewish agendas served, like other conspiracy theories, to alleviate the painful inability to understand the complex modern world. The last but not least noteworthy feature of the image of the enemy was its chimeric quality, as Gavin Langmuir has observed in many demonic presentations of the Jews since the Middle Ages. The arch enemy possessed certain traits that to a rational mind were incompatible. Quote, Jewish nationalists could be simultaneously, quote, rootless cosmopolitans, and, quote, Stalinists, end quote, could act as, quote, agents of American imperialism, end quote. The chimera of Greek mythology was an impossible beast with the body of a goat, a lion's head, and the tail of a serpent, rather like the Stalinist agents of American imperialism. Clearly, the propaganda exploited old and deep-rooted images of the Jew, but the presence of the chimera in the 1968 campaign can be explained not only through reference to the rich and European legacy of Judeophobia. The, quote, Zionist was not the only enemy whom communists endowed with the traits of an impossible beast. Soviet propaganda, at least since the 1930s, and then communist propaganda in Poland, had constructed many more or less chimeric images of the enemy. Trotsky and Bukharin, who were, quote, lackeys of capitalists, end quote, and counter-revolution, leaders of the Home Army, Polish anti-Nazi underground, who were chauvinists and agents of the Gestapo, quote, fascist social democrats, and so on. In view of both the content of the hate speech and the patterns of the campaign, the March campaign appears to be more a return of the ghosts of Stalinism than of right-wing anti-Semitism. New section, handy and defective. The feeling of revulsion which many observers and historians of the campaign have expressed should not prevent us from asking whether the campaign was effective. Did those who initiated and ran the campaign achieve their objectives? Was it cost-effective? It seems that they mostly did, and that they found the cost acceptable, at least in the short term. Given their cynicism, which many of them proved, claims that the campaign was morally reprehensible, aesthetically repugnant, and in some respects outright criminal, probably would not count for much. The choice of a, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, campaign as a policy instrument was therefore rational. The campaign served several goals. Crushing any real Zionist was probably among the least important. First, the campaign was a reaction to the student protests and dissent among intellectuals. It was a tool for fighting the youth rebellion through compromising its alleged instigators, leaders, and goals as alien and perverse. Second, quote, anti-Zionism was used to prevent the youth rebellion from spreading beyond the universities to broader groups, industrial workers in particular. at least since the autumn of 1967, when a series of strikes and other industrial protests followed a rise in food prices. The party leaders have been seriously concerned about the possible eruption of popular unrest. This seems the most important motive for allowing and maintaining the aggressive and demagogic campaign, portraying the dissident students and intellectuals as aliens, Jews, bloodstained Stalinists, or their sons, arrogant members of the establishment, and so forth, certainly contributed to alienating them from the masses. Although quite a number of young workers joined the student riots, as the police data on arrest shows, the authorities managed to prevent a major explosion. Today we know that they managed only to postpone it. In December 1970, violent workers' protests against the new rise in food prices led to a bloody confrontation and serious political crisis that eventually ended Gomulka's rule. Notably, while after the campaign, quote, anti-Zionism, and quote, largely disappeared from the media and public discourse and did not return. The MSW archives show that the security service continued to focus on Jews and used some of the anti-Jewish claims tested in March to fight the democratic opposition throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The third main objective of the campaign was to change the political balance in the party leadership. Those who decided on the campaign never revealed this explicitly, but their behavior confirms what the answer to the question "Sui prodest" suggests. The March attack on, quote, Zionists revitalized the conflict that had crystallized in the Politburo around Gomulka's speech of the 19th of June 1967. The new attack gave its proponents a strategic advantage over their adversaries, who were forced on the defensive and deprived of support from the actif. Within a few weeks, the latter realized their defeat. On the 8th of April, the Politburo met for the first time since the beginning of the crisis, with the notable absence of Minister of Foreign Affairs, Rapowski, who had requested release from his position after the anti-Jewish hunt began in his ministry, and the silent, that is, neutralized presence of Marshal Spychalski, who had long been the object of intrigues, including anti-Semitic gossip. In the discussion on the campaign, Ohab, Yedrichovsky, and Zur, who adopted a critical stance, faced Gomulka, Ignacy Logozovinsky, Ryszard Strzelecki, Zenon Klisko, Gierek, and Klarenkiewicz, who praised or justified it. The remainder supported the majority or refrained from taking a clear stand. In summarizing the discussion, which was the traditional way in which the first secretary expressed the party leadership's position, Gomulka could therefore legitimately approve the campaign thus far, with some minor reservations about its anti-Jewish excess. Many years later, Edvard Ohab published a short letter that he had handed to Gomulka in 1968. Quote, "As a Pole and a communist, I protest with the deepest outrage against the anti-Semitic plot organized in Poland by various dark forces, yesterday's members of the radical national camp and their current mighty protectors. In the situation that has developed in our party, I am forced to convey my protest in the form of a resignation from my mandate as a member of the Political Bureau. Simultaneously, I submit my resignation to the position of Chairman of the Council of State, as well as Chairman of the OKFJN, Front for National Unity." Thus the March campaign enabled Gomulka to marginalize his opponents and reconsolidate the party leadership on his terms. In addition, the once powerful, quote, bankrupt politicians, end quote, Zembrowski in particular, who to some party leaders could still appear as potential challengers, were marginalized for good. The hard work of Mosar's officers also proved to be not in vain. They had not only, quote, helped the party, end quote, as they had been requested, they had also defeated their own political adversaries and muted their critics, as well as made thousands of Jews, whom they had so much resented and suspected, decide to leave Poland forever. This article is focused on the political uses and abuses of the campaign, that is, its rationality, but we should not reduce participants and authors of the campaign to rational agents. Poland in spring 1968 was the scene of innumerable expressions of the most irrational resentments and prejudices, which infused the words and deeds not only of the excited participants in the hate meetings, but also the officials and officers at the medium and upper levels of the state party power structure. The pursuit of rationally defined political interests clearly combined with irrational impulses. Indeed, these different kinds of motivation combined well, and irrational anti-Jewish prejudice and resentment seem to have had a strange capacity to bring about quite rationally organized actions. Releasing and exploiting hateful emotions and opinions in 1968 obviously contributed to their invigoration and persistence well after 1968. Gomulka wanted to minimize this. A few times he warned against it, but clearly this was not the priority, and even less so for most of the party apparatchiks or police officers. The above political objectives acquire greater weight in the context of developments in Czechoslovakia. As Gomulka claimed at the 8th April meeting of the Politburo, the radicalism of the campaign was well justified by the alleged preparations for counter-revolution in the neighboring country and its possible spread to Poland. If that was true from truly his perspective, then the brutal repression, the hate campaign, and the mobilization of the party served as a preemptive strike against potential followers of the Czech path, as well as a means of consolidating the entire party, not just its leadership. A few months later, the Polish army obediently participated in the Warsaw Pact forces' intervention in Czechoslovakia. Fresh memories of the March repression certainly contributed to intimidation of potential opponents to the intervention. A result that the top decision-makers had not necessarily premeditated but accepted during the campaign was the beginning of a greater mobility of cadres, which enabled them to advance their own loyal people in particular. This was very important to many younger apparatchiks, whose frustration had been growing for several years at the old guard, who had held on to positions and blocked their career paths. To many such people, the purge offered a chance for upward mobility, or at least a new hope for it. The personnel changes of 1968 began a major generational change that accelerated in the early 1970s following the fall of Gomulka. Playing the Jewish card was thus multifunctional and contributed to bringing about the desired or desirable effects. As for the cost, it is not clear to what extent the decision-makers could see or anticipate them at the time. Critics of the campaign warned Gomulka that it encouraged and rewarded immoral behavior and harmed innocent people, including devout party members, while promoting unscrupulous opportunists and so forth. This is not pleasant to hear, but it did not make Gomulka halt the campaign. This was not, arguments that it was getting out of control and undermining the leader's rule proved more important for the decision to end the campaign. For example, some high-ranking, quote, non-Zionist, end quote, officials were dismissed without the required consent of the party authorities, which is a major breach of the principles of the nomenclatura system. Sometimes excited participants in the hate meetings reached wrong conclusions. For example, if the, quote, Zionists had been responsible for economic shortages and rising food prices, the prices should decrease now, ... or attacked the wrong people, such as Gomulka's right hand, Zenon Klitschko. Let's see who this person is, if anything comes up. Zenon Klitschko lived from 1908 to 1989 and was a politician in the Polish People's Republic Consider the right-hand man of Polish United Workers' Party, leader Władysław Gomulka. He was born in Lodz and died in Warsaw. How do you say this city?
Łódź. Łódź. Łódź.
Lodz. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Lodz. Back to the text. A costly consequence of the 1968 campaign, which the party leaders probably could not anticipate, was a profound disillusionment with the regime amongst those segments of the Polish intelligentsia who had sympathized with its socialist slogans. For many people who had dreamed of a, quote, socialism with a human face, and, quote, the events of 1968 in Poland and in Czechoslovakia were the final blow to such beliefs and left no doubts that the regime's officially declared ideology was dead. In particular, the experience of 1968 set many talented and courageous young people on a path towards open opposition. Later, they significantly contributed to the development of dissident organizations in the 1970s and the Solidarity movement in the 1980s, and eventually to the regime's end. None seem to have calculated the human capital loss due to the post-March immigration. It was the best educated wave of immigrants from Poland ever. Several thousand members of the Polish intelligentsia, including many outstanding scientists, artists, and writers, left the country. A long-lasting consequence of the campaign was its contribution to the image of Poland abroad as a country of incurable anti-Semitism, a problem that Poles and Polish governments were to face repeatedly up to the present. Okay, and that's the end of the piece. This has been Anti-Zionism as a Multi-Purpose Policy Instrument, the Anti-Zionist Campaign in Poland, 1967 to 1968, by Dariusz Stola. Let's see one more time how to pronounce that according to Google Translate.
Dariusz Stola.
Dariusz Stola. Thanks for listening.